If you have conscious memories of gaming for, let's say, somewhere between 15 to 30 years, I think you start to associate certain times of year with certain video games and video game consoles. And for me, the deepest, darkest, coldest days of February are always associated with the Nintendo Game Boy. I'll never forget the day that I got my Game Boy. It was a snowstorm in, I want to say, early 1994. And I had saved up money, I guess maybe from Christmas or something like that. And I had sort of been badgering my parents, hey, I want you to take me to this a new store that opened up called Best Buy. And in this Best Buy store, they have all kinds of things, and I want to buy a Nintendo Game Boy. And so I think it was a Saturday or Sunday, and the snow's coming down, and for whatever reason, my mother said, hey, let's get in the car, let's go to that Best Buy, let's get the Game Boy. Now, this was shocking because my parents were very risk-averse people, and I couldn't believe that my mother would drive me in the snowstorm in our 1987 silver Nissan Sentra that didn't do well on dry pavement, let alone any kind of extreme weather condition, that we would take that and pick this item up. And I'll never forget, as we were driving, the storm gets worse and worse. There's no one in the Best Buy. And I pick up the Game Boy and get The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. Went home that night and played it all night, and I just remember, in that snowstorm, sitting in my bed with what was, I think, the system's most impressive game. But my history with the Game Boy doesn't start there, and I should probably mention the reason why, after all these years, I'm talking about it. I was never somebody who was a handheld gamer. I always preferred console games. I preferred the PC experience, and handheld gaming was always just kind of something off to the side for me. The reason why I'm kind of rediscovering or recalling these memories about the Game Boy is that I recently got the Analogue Pocket, which is shaped like a Game Boy, and I'm going to reserve comment on that in this video because I'm going to talk about it on the next episode of my podcast with Jay Shai of Shin Megami Talks, so I don't want to repeat myself. But that console and the act of popping in those Game Boy cartridges sort of brought back a flood of memories that I quite frankly had forgotten. So the history didn't start in that moment, in that snowstorm, with the Game Boy and Link's Awakening. I would say for handheld gaming, it actually began for me, like for many, with the Tiger Electronics handheld games that you could get. And they were licensed off of different video game properties, movie properties, things like that. And that was what you took on road trips. And those were, I think, back in the day, as cool as they seemed, they were rather disappointing as games. Now, I haven't played all of them, and I know they've become recently somewhat popular. So I'll gladly stand to be corrected if there's one or two that were really good. But in my mind, they were kind of like electromechanical diversions, these little pattern recognition games that almost allowed you to imagine the game that you had at home or the arcade game that you played, but had very little in the way of fun built into them. So if I went on a road trip or went over to the grandparents' house, I might take one of those, but they were, after a while, not as exciting as, say, the Ninja Turtles action figure that I had or the G.I. Joes that I would bring. And it's funny, as I was thinking of Game Boy, of course, again, playing Link's Awakening in that snowstorm was a memory, but then I also had a memory of playing it shortly after release, or maybe the year after release, somewhere between 89 and 90. And of course, I played Tetris and Super Mario Land, the first Mario game on the system. And I kind of asked myself, why do I have memories of playing those early launch games in my house, in my room, when I didn't have the console myself at that time? And I kind of racked my brain about this, and I think what happened was, the Game Boy was, and I don't know to what degree people know this now or remember this, but it was extremely popular. It was a cool mobile device, kind of in that Walkman territory. And a lot of people had them who weren't gamers. And Tetris was incredibly fun. It was that addictive game that even the adults liked back then. So what I think happened was either a neighbor or a friend of the family, somebody who was maybe in their 30s or early 40s at the time, had gotten one for Christmas or had gotten one for his birthday, got over the kind of initial interest in it, and lent it to me. And I don't remember who this person is, but I do remember this was an adult. The thing was in great condition. The box, it had and everything that came with it, and was really pristine. It was clear that a child had not used this. And so I have very vivid memories of playing Tetris and Super Mario Land. And Tetris, I didn't get Tetris. I was a young kid. It didn't seem that exciting. I was coming from the NES, all the platformers, sports games, action games, things like that. And to me, Tetris was not a game that I could consciously enjoy. And I played it, and I would lose, but I wasn't really enjoying it. And then Super Mario Land. Now, this was pretty impressive in the sense that if you're coming from those Tiger Electronic games, to have a full-fledged Mario game on a handheld device, be able to take that with you and play Mario on the go, it was special. I can't deny that. But I also remember thinking quite clearly that, this is not really as good as Mario 1, 2, and 3 that I'm playing on my TV screen. And while I enjoyed the time that I had with it, I didn't really have any qualms about giving this thing back to the person. It didn't click with me. It almost felt like, oh, this is entertaining. This is a nice Nintendo amusement, but I want to get back to the main event. I want to get back to the real deal, and that was the NES. So we'll fast forward a few years, and the Game Gear comes out. And now it's in color. It's from Sega. It's got Sonic. It's moving so quickly, at least in the commercials. And I don't know if this was a birthday gift or something, or a graduation gift. I remember in the spring of that year, I think maybe 92, I got the Sega Game Gear. And I almost remember having a choice, like my parents saying, listen, we're not getting any more games for the television, but if you would like a handheld system, we'll do that. And I went with the Game Gear. And I talked about the Game Gear on this channel, and I did a personal history on it. And it was a fine console, but I think in the end it was somewhat disappointing in the sense that as the Game Boy evolved and I became aware of the better games that were on the Game Boy, the Game Gear just felt lacking. And of course, what I didn't realize, it was basically a handheld Master System. And I had my fun with some of the games. To me, the Sonic games were a good replacement. Not a good replacement, but good as a replacement for the Sonic games that I couldn't play if we were on the road. Now, obviously, if the two consoles, Genesis and the Game Gear, were side by side, I would pick the Genesis any time. So the Game Gear was fine, but it had its problems. It ate a lot of batteries, or you'd have to kind of tether yourself to the wall. And I felt like once you kind of got past the Sega-developed games, things were kind of weak. So much like with the Genesis and the SNES and the whole kind of conflict there that I've talked about on this channel, I had the Sega product, but I regretted not having the Nintendo product. And then if we kind of go back to that situation where, if you haven't been following the channel, basically I couldn't have an SNES because I had chosen the TurboGrafx, and then I upgraded to the Genesis. But my parents were angry that the SNES was not backwards compatible with the NES. They had spent all this money on NES games and gear and stuff like that. And so I could not have the SNES. And as time went on, I really regretted that. I really wanted to get into Nintendo and play the RPGs and experience what my peers were experiencing on that system. So that is what led me to the Game Boy. It was kind of like, all right, I can't play those high-end AAA SNES titles, but Nintendo's winning this war, I mean, as far as content was concerned, for me, the kind of games that I liked. So if I could just get into that ecosystem somehow, I would be happy. And the Game Boy was the system that did that for me. So my collection, and not even my physical collection of games, but my collection of memories around this console was ultimately fairly limited because I got it as I was becoming a teenager, and once I kind of hit those teenage years and in high school and stuff like that, I really moved away from it, and it just kind of like sat in this drawer in my bedroom. I had this kind of like wooden nightstand, smelled very strongly of pine, and in the bottom drawer I would just sort of keep the Nintendo Game Boy, and later years didn't play it. I mean, I had a PlayStation. I was playing Symphony of the Night. I was, playing Madden on the original PlayStation. Eventually got the N64, and so I just didn't. At a certain point, I kind of missed all of the Pokemon stuff. I missed the Game Boy Color. But for that slice of time, let's call it 94 to 96, I just felt like, though it was not going to stand in for the Super Nintendo, it was not going to make up for the fact that I couldn't play games like Breath of Fire, Illusion of Gaia, Secret of Mana, things like that. But that nonetheless, Donkey Kong Country, I so desperately wanted to play that. Nonetheless, the system was keeping me in the loop on Nintendo in some way, shape, or form. I mean, that it's silly in a way to think back on it, but as a kid, that's how I felt. And Link's Awakening was the game that did it for me. I felt like it was just amazing how the Game Boy created a Legend of Zelda world in this little screen. And it was every bit as good as the Super Nintendo version, as the original NES Legend of Zelda. And in fact, looking back, this is the game I prefer to all of those, although A Link to the Past is a very, very close, like, second, or if Link's Awakening is 1, Link to the Past is 1A. But I just was extremely impressed about the world creation that went on in that little green screen. And then subsequently, I think that also launched Pokemon. And I say subsequently, like, in later years, I did go back and play some of those early Pokemon games once I understood what Pokemon was about. But I think the worlds that those games generated couldn't have been done without Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. Now, the other games that I have very vivid memories of playing back in that time were the Final Fantasy Adventure and Legend spin-off games. I had Final Fantasy Adventure, Final Fantasy Legend, and Final Fantasy Legend 2. And hey, people were playing Final Fantasy 6 on the SNES, so darn it, I was going to play my own Final Fantasy on the Game Boy. And of course, when you play these games are clearly not Final Fantasy. But what I didn't realize was that Adventure was the start of the Secret of Mana series, and even I didn't realize it when I was asking for it and getting the game, but when I was playing it, I was like, oh, wait a minute, I'm playing like Final Fantasy and Secret of Mana mashup. And then the Legends games were, I think, the start of the Saga series. But again, these were pretty well fleshed out RPG worlds, and that was exactly what I was looking for. And I remember when I got all three of these games, I had asked, my parents asked me, what did I want to do for my birthday? And they kind of intimated, like, you got to get out of the house. Like, let's not just sit around the house and play video games. You got to tell us someplace to take you. So in a very funny way, like, I said, I want to go to a sports bar. Now I'm not even a teenager at this time, or I might have been, I don't know, 12 or 13 or something like that. And they kind of looked at me quizzically and then found some kind of sports bar that was kid friendly. And I had some family and friends there. And they kind of, were opening presents. And I got these 3 games. And my parents were like, well, "This is what the hell are these? Why does he want these games? Why are we even at this sports bar? I don't even think there was a game on. I just wanted to play air hockey or something like that." So anyway, I just always have this memory of coming home, cracking open Final Fantasy Adventure and Final Fantasy Legend, and just kind of having that moment of closeness to Nintendo. And I know that's so weird, but like closeness to that RPG experience that I wasn't getting on the TV screen. So when you talk about nearness to Nintendo, one game that also did that for me was Super Mario Land 2: The Six Golden Coins. This game was extremely special, and I think it's one of the best showcases of what Nintendo could do on the platform. Now, unlike other games, whether it was Final Fantasy or Legend of Zelda, I'd actually played the Super Mario World game on the SNES quite a bit at friends' homes and at families' homes and things like that. So while I certainly hadn't beat the game and I certainly hadn't discovered all that there was to discover in it, I felt like I knew enough about how great it was. And when I picked up this Game Boy version of Super Mario Land 2, I actually didn't have such high hopes for it, in the sense that I had played the first one, and as I said, I wasn't terribly impressed with the first one, but the graphics kind of looked like they were refreshed, and I felt like, well, if it can give me just a 20%, 30% of what Super Mario World provided on the SNES, I would be happy. And like I said, this game kind of blew out those expectations. It is one of my favorite Mario games to date. And I just felt the level design, the visuals, everything was just so perfectly crafted for the Game Boy. And this is one, in addition to Link's Awakening, this is a game that I played on many a deep, dark February night. Now, another game that I have great memories of is Golf, or Mario Golf, on the Game Boy. And I think it was Mario Golf on maybe the Game Boy Color, and it was just called Golf on the Game Boy and on the NES. And it was basically just Mario superimposed upon Nintendo's early golf game. And I had a blast with this, played this all the time, except it was funny, I did a video on this many, many years ago, and I went back and I listened to the video, and in that video I claimed that I had picked this up in the early 90s and played it. And I talked about how this was kind of like one of the early titles that I got with Tetris and Super Mario Land. But as I said here, I don't think I actually owned the Game Boy. I think it was lent to me for some extended period of time. So maybe I did purchase it back then, or maybe I'm just mixing up the memories here as I walk down memory lane. But I definitely had it and enjoyed it. And I still would claim it's one of the best early golf games just in the 8-bit slash 16-bit era, of course, until we come to something like Neo Turf Masters. But it's I just played it. I played the Game Boy Color version not too long ago, and it's still a really good, really fun take on golf. And then kind of the last batch of games that I enjoyed back in the day during this, as I said, 2-year period, were the Donkey Kong games. Now, Donkey Kong, the original Game Boy Donkey Kong, it was kind of a remake of the classic Nintendo Donkey Kong game, and it was really faithful. Now, I didn't particularly like the arcade Donkey Kong back when I was a kid. I felt that, it was a little bit before my time, and I didn't really have any nostalgia for it, and I felt like it was primitive compared to the games that I was playing in that day, in that time as a kind of an early teenager. However, what was interesting about this game, and the reason why I got it, was that I want to say it was one of the first games that was Super Game Boy compatible. Now, you might ask, well, what did that matter? You didn't have an SNES and you weren't getting one. Yes, that is true, but I kind of held out hope that, okay, I can't play it on the NES now, but someday when I'm older and I can pick up, or, the SNES, I can play it on the Super Game Boy. And that did ultimately come true a few years later. But just as a regular Donkey Kong game, the great thing about it was, yes, you were playing through Donkey Kong, but then when you kind of completed the arcade game, the world expanded and you had different, more complex levels, and it was truly, truly a fun game. Then we get to the Donkey Kong Land games. And when I was in school, around this time, everyone was talking about Donkey Kong Country. Donkey Kong Country was really a seminal moment for the Super Nintendo. It had those pre-rendered graphics. Yeah, it was a platformer, but it just looked like nothing else that we had seen. And a lot of the people who were in the Nintendo camp were saying, this is proof that Nintendo has beaten Sega. Sega cannot produce a game that looks like this. And I agreed with them, even though I was in the Sega camp. I was like, if only I could play Donkey Kong Country. And the closest I got was playing it at one of those old Super Nintendo kiosks. And of course, I grew up in the Northeast, so in a Bradley store. And if you were around that area, those kind of old school, had the CRT and the two little controllers popping out of it. Loved what little I played of Donkey Kong Country. And then I discovered the Donkey Kong Land series, which was an attempt to bring Donkey Kong Country and the pre-rendered graphics of Donkey Kong Country to the Game Boy. And I'll have to admit I was kind of skeptical, but again, I was in the, this is the best I'm going to get mindset. So I bought the first one, and the second one, either they came out in quick succession, or I was able to save up enough money to get the first one a little bit after its release, and then the next one came out, and I maybe got that for a holiday or birthday or something like that. In any event, I always remember having both Donkey Kong Land and Donkey Kong Land 2. I think I eventually got Donkey Kong Land 3. But all of these games were actually very good games, and they did capture that pre-rendered aesthetic pretty well for the Game Boy. Of course, it's not really going to look the same, but the graphics had the meatiness of the Super Nintendo. And again, at that time, I had not seen side-scrolling platformers that had this type of look to them. The Game Boy brought that as best it could. And then they were just well-designed, fun games to play. So this delivered for me, really on all accounts. So if you've followed the channel, you'll know that when I was a kid, one of the things I was asked to do frequently, or in fact, in some cases, it was a condition for me to get a new system, was that I had to donate the games and hardware that I currently had to a charity or to someone that we knew who could use them. And at this point in my life, like I said, I was starting to kind of have my own money, and I was becoming a teenager. So my parents didn't really do that to me with the Game Boy per se. There was no sort of plan that was contingent upon me giving it away. But as I was getting older, and like I said, I kind of skipped the Game Boy Color. I was into the PlayStation and the N64, and I really wasn't playing the Game Boy as much. My parents came to me and said, we these friends of ours, they have a son. That might be 4 years younger than you, and he just got a Game Boy, and they weren't able to buy him a lot of games. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could just lend him some of your games? You're not using them. I was just cleaning your room. They're sitting in your drawer. So at that point, I was like, oh yeah, no problem. You I want to save the Game Boy, but yeah, give him the whole bag. I'm good. I got the PlayStation. Well, they went out the door and they never came back. So I really had no Game Boy in my life for, I would say, a decade or more. The whole Pokemon thing, it just never interested me. I couldn't identify with it. So when all the kids had their Game Boy Colors with the backlit screen and stuff like that, I was like, well, that's great for kids. I'm an adult now. I'm in the 32-bit, 64-bit era. I don't need that stuff. And it actually wasn't until I picked up the Retron 5, which had a slot for, I think, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advanced games. And I decided, hey, I'm going to try it. I'm going to kind of buy some of the games that I had given away. So the Donkey Kong games, Super Mario Land. I haven't picked up Link's Awakening because it was too expensive back then. And of course now it's super expensive to get it in the box. But I also decided, hey, I missed out on the Wario Land games. And they, I believe, were, or at least Wario Land 3 was a Game Boy Color game. The other one was just a regular Game Boy game. And Wario Land was great, and I had some nostalgia for this because I played the heck out of Wario Land for the Virtual Boy, and that's a story for another time. So I played those quite a bit, and again, Donkey Kong, great platformers. Wario Land, maybe even a better platformer, and sort of following in the tradition of Super Mario Land 2. I also picked up a couple puzzle games that I really liked. One was Pokemon Puzzle Challenge, which was not necessarily a Pokemon game, but it was the Game Boy's version of, I believe it was Tetris Attack, which was a Super Nintendo game, and it wasn't really Tetris. It was kind of like a match 3 game, and then I discovered, there was actually a Tetris Attack on the Game Boy as well. It was enhanced for the Super Game Boy. So I played those games primarily along with Super Mario Land 2 and the Donkey Kong game on that console and appreciated it. But also it was like, well, there's other games I want to play on the Retron 5. So these were fun to collect, but it was kind of just a little side project. And then over the years, actually, a good friend of mine for birthdays and holidays would give me a sealed Game Boy game for many years. So I have a collection, not like super expensive stuff at the time, although a couple of them have become rather pricey. I think one was like an F1 game, and then there was a very early Nintendo shmup, which I am blanking on. I think it was Solar Striker. I think that was the name, and that is, in time become extremely desirable. So I have a stack of sealed Game Boy games, but I'm not going to open them at this point. So how do you sum up the Game Boy? I think obviously, as I've said, for me it has that special place as being my connection to the world of Nintendo at a time when that connection was severed. But I think more broadly, Game Boy was a truly revolutionary console. It was, of course, the first time that you could take meaningfully developed video games that were better than just little one-screen toys out on the road. And I'm sure it was great to sort of play it in the car if you're on a large, like a huge car trip across the country or something like that. My family never did that. And, I was kind of had motion sickness. So in the few times that I tried to bring it in the car, it just really didn't work out for me. But looking back, I think the true genius of Game Boy was that it was perhaps the first mass-marketed device that allowed kids to have screen time. And I know this is like a very weird concept for people growing up today, or even for people who have kind of been, living in the digital age as adults for 10, 15, 20 years now. But I can think back to a time when all of the screens in your house shut off. I mean, there was that time at night. If you were playing Nintendo on a television, and hey, your parents were going to see it. You had that CRT glow coming from your room. I grew up in a house with one computer, and that computer was shut off at about 10 p.m. That was just the rule, and it was downstairs. So if I snuck downstairs, my parents would hear it. And of course, in those days with dial-up internet and stuff like that, they could probably get the phone bill and see when I was online. So there was just no screen time. And then with the Game Boy, this was the first time. Well, I really shouldn't say the first time because I had the Game Gear. But like I said, the Game Gear was clunky. It was power hungry. So I don't really remember taking the Game Gear to bed with me. But with the Game Boy, I could, whether I was borrowing it or now, when I owned it, sort of the bulk of the story, I could sit in my room with, of course, my Game Boy magnifying glass and light apparatus that you had to put on the Game Boy, but I could have screen time, and I could sit in bed until 3 in the morning and play The Legend of Zelda, play Mario, play, the Donkey Kong Land games, and no one would know. My parents wouldn't know. I could put headphones on so they, that they wouldn't hear the music. And I think that was the experience that the Analogue Pocket gave me, because it has the same form factor. And it just so happened that I was popped one of the games in, was just sitting in bed one night, and I said, oh my God, this is an experience that I haven't had since I was a child. And it was special to have your own private screen and your own private screen time. And of course, now that experience is absolutely ubiquitous. So the Game Boy will always hold a special place in my heart. It is a console that, really punched above its weight and did its best to give you a true Nintendo experience despite its limitations. So I'd be curious to know what your experiences are or were with the Game Boy, and what memories you have of the console. Let me know down below.